Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the NJA. We'd like to present Adam Levick giving a workshop on the work camera does, how we can work together, and really things we can do to influence media, and so particularly influence the media, how to react to the media effectively to affect change, and how we can work together to really amplify the message which camera does. I'll tell you a little bit about Adam. He is presently the co-editor of Camera UK. He previously worked as a researcher for NGO Monitor, and prior to that at the Civil Rights Division of ADL. He's published lots of op-eds in Jewish and non-Jewish publications, and published papers, longer papers at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs on anti-Semitism in progressive blogs and anti-Semitic cartoons in progressive blogs. He was previously a member of the online anti-Semitism working group, the Global Forum to Combat Anti-Semitism. And with no more ado, over to you, Adam.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. Okay, thanks everybody. Welcome. First, I'm going to give a little bit of history. I made Aliyah in 2009. The year that an organization you may have heard of called CIF Watch was started. That stood for Comment is Free Watch. Comment is Free, of course, was the online home of commentary at The Guardian. So in 2009, a gentleman by the name of Gary Emanuel, British, who was then living in the US, was so infuriated by the coverage of Israel and The Guardian and their tolerance for anti-Semitism that he, on his own, rounded up a group of volunteers and founded this organization whose sole mission was to monitor The Guardian and combat their egregious anti-Israel bias, which I don't need to tell anybody here about. So a year later, he got a grant to hire a managing editor, and that person was me. That was 2010. And basically for 2 years, my job was to do nothing each day other than read The Guardian and read the comments, the cesspits of the comments of The Guardian, and to blog about it, to tweet about it, and to complain to editors when we saw mistakes. After 2 years, we decided that there's this media outlet you may have heard of called the BBC, which also has problematic content about Israel. And so we launched BBC Watch in 2012, and we hired Hadar Sela, the British-born Israeli woman named Hadar Sela, to manage that. Okay, then something happened in 2012. We lost our funding, which happens. And this organization in the US called Camera, based in Boston, was interested in expanding their presence in the UK, meaning they wanted to expand their coverage of the UK media. So we merged. We merged with Camera in 2012. We changed our name to UK Media Watch in 2015, and then in 2020, we changed our name to Camera UK. And just briefly about Camera, I don't know if people here are familiar with Camera, but it was founded in 1982. Around the time of this first Lebanon war, which is when we trace the beginning of the media's transformation from being largely sympathetic to Israel's story to being unsympathetic. That's when the David and Goliath transformation began, we believe. So that's when Camera started in Boston. Camera monitors the media in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Hebrew, and Arabic. And Arabic is our newest department, and which is helpful because, as you know, BBC has Arabic, a big Arabic division, which we now monitor. Sky News has an Arabic division. The Independent has an Arabic division. So we monitor the Arabic media, not Al Jazeera, but we monitor the media outlets that claim to uphold Western standards in media, not the serious outlets. We have staff in the US, Israel, and the UK. I work in the Israel office. We have a campus division. Now, the campus division has a different mission. The campus division's mission is to empower Jewish and all pro-Israel students on campus with the information and tools necessary to combat, which I'm sure everyone in this room knows, is an egregious atmosphere of anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism on a lot of college campuses. So we have a very big campus staff. And we also have a new educational division, which tries to push back against anti-Israel lessons in school curriculums, which is a big increasing problem. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you some of our guiding principles, and this is the principles that have guided my work for the past 12 years. And this may seem intuitive to those in this room and those watching on Zoom, but I want to stress that, every day when I go to work, I insist that there aren't merely competing narratives about the conflict, that there are facts, and that facts matter, and that through careful research and careful work, the facts of what happens in Israel or the Palestinian territories can be determined. And it's the job of the media to not just advance a cause, not to be activists, but to do due diligence and find out what the truth is. Their job is not to speak truth to power. Their job is not to comfort the afflicted while afflicting the comfortable. And their job is not to be part of the resistance. Their job within a democracy is an important one. And one of our kind of meta goals is to promote the idea that journalists cannot simultaneously be activists and journalists at the same time. They have to pick and choose. They can be a pro-Palestinian activist, or they can be a journalist, but they can't be both at the same time. And we also believe that's a responsibility, not just us, but of citizens, of concerned citizens like yourself, to push back when there's lies, when there's misleading claims, when there's smears of Israel, smears of Jews, when there's explicit anti-Semitism. We feel what we do is a sacred mission. We feel it's not just us, but we like to empower those of you who follow our work to get involved. And I'm going to get more into that as we go on. All right, so this is how we make our voice heard. Oftentimes when we come across a error in a British media outlet, like The Guardian, to use a random example, we email the journalist and give them a chance to respond. When they don't respond to us, then we oftentimes will tweet them, because we find that Twitter is a great tool to really go after journalists who otherwise could ignore your email, but it's a lot harder for journalists to ignore your tweet because other people see that tweet, and if they don't answer it, oftentimes they can be embarrassed on Twitter. So we find that Twitter, for all of its problems, and it's a cesspit, and it's really hard oftentimes to be a Jewish activist on Twitter, but it's also a great tool to go after the people that matter. If we don't hear from the journalist after emailing them and tweeting them, we email the editor, either the foreign editor or the Middle East editor. And also we can tweet the foreign editor or the Middle East editor. Again, this is just, we're going down from the journalist to the editor. And when that doesn't work, then we can use online complaint forms. Most media outlets like the Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail, the Independent have online dedicated complaint forms. Now, one of the reasons why I'm here today is to encourage you to use those complaint forms, to be more activists. One of the problems of being based in Israel and not being based in the UK is that we have a harder time kind of corralling the passion and the support that you all have for Israel to help us in our mission. So, hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll be a little more inclined to be activists, to be pro-Israel activists, to be activists for truth. So I'll get into more of it, but it's really important that we push back as best we can against these when you come across something that's simply not true, or something that's misleading, or something that's defamatory about Israel or Jews. And as many of you know, there's also IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization. That's the last resort. It's hard to win an IPSO, but if the media outlet doesn't uphold your complaint, and if you are sure it's accurate, your complaint, then you can take it to IPSO, and we've had some success with them. So again, we have a blog. It's Camera UK, and you can also subscribe to our post by email, which I think Lawrence does. We have a very active Twitter account. We have 25,000 people that follow us on Twitter. We have an active Facebook account, increasingly active Instagram account. I don't know how many of you are active on social media, but that's the new frontier, and that's something that we really continually need to be aware of, the impact of social media. And actually, my next goal for this year is to ramp up our presence on Instagram, because a lot of young people are on Instagram, and I don't count myself amongst the young people. And again, we also have a letter writing campaign. We have a couple hundred people, mostly based in the US, but we're trying to ramp up our British friends to contact when there's an especially egregious error in a mainstream newspaper, whether it be American or British. we launch our letter writers we give them the facts and we ask them to write in their own words to the editors, why they need to correct this error. So we kind of have a multi-pronged attack on correcting media errors. And these are just a few of the examples. Again, so, we hold journalists and editors accountable to their own editorial standards. That is the UK Editors Code of Practice, which I'll get into further later. We're not, asking them to be pro-Israel. We're asking them to take their job as journalists, as editors, as members of the professional media class seriously. And our communications with them reflect that. We ask them to don't be easier in Israel, but be more diligent in making sure that what you're reporting that's going out to sometimes tens of millions of people online is accurate. Okay, so one of the things we focus on is corrections. Now, a lot of people who support our mission but are skeptical of the efficacy of corrections will say, well, who's really going to notice the correction on page 37A the next day? And, we have a couple answers for that. First of all, most content is online, right? I mean, the significance of print publications are not what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? So if we get the Guardian to agree to correct an article that had a mistake, and they correct the online edition, that online edition is correct forever, meaning whenever someone comes across that online article, it has the correct information. So corrections do matter. We also think that corrections have a cumulative effect on coverage. So for instance, in 2010 to 2014, The Guardian had this habit of insisting, despite the evidence, that the Western Wall, the Kotel, was the holiest site in journalism. Now, as we all know in this room, that's not true. The Western Wall is simply the holiest site where Jews are currently permitted to daven, to pray. The holiest site is the Temple Mount. Why is that important? Because whenever they show photos of Jews ascending to the Temple Mount, if the news consumers are convinced that the Temple Mount has no particular religious significance to Jews, then Jews come across as looking like interlopers, right? That they're simply there to invade the mosque or to, just to give Muslims who are worshiping there a hard time. So after dozens of complaints in which, we didn't know that we were having an impact, but we were, they slowly began to stop insisting against all evidence that the Western Wall was the holiest site in Judaism. And now they finally, 9 times out of 10, the Guardian and the Independent and the other problematic outlets, they will acknowledge that Temple Mount is the holy site in Judaism. So again, this is the impact of corrections. This is why we go for corrections, because once something's corrected, they have a hard time justifying giving that lie again. Also, journalists don't like us, but the fact that we're keeping them accountable, the fact that I'm reading every word that they write. I say a Jerusalem correspondent like Beth Ann McKernan, the Guardian's current Jerusalem correspondent. The fact that she knows she's being watched, the fact that she knows that everything she writes is being under scrutiny, that I scrutinize it with a magnifying glass, the fact that they know they can't get away with what they could get away with if we weren't monitoring them. So I think psychologically it plays a part in the coverage, and I think the coverage would be much worse. As bad as it is, we think the coverage would be much worse if we weren't continually monitoring them. Also, the delegitimization campaigns against Israel, such as the apartheid lie, are fueled by falsehoods. We feel that corrections set the record straight and push back against these demonizing narratives. Also, corrections embarrass journalists. When a Guardian has to acknowledge that their journalist got something wrong, the journalist knows that, they were embarrassed, that they said something they wrote something that wasn't true. So the name and shame element of what we do, I think, can't be understated. Also the title of my talk is called Truth or Post-Truth. Now, we define post-truth as the trend in journalism where objective facts are seen as less important than reports designed to reinforce the reader's beliefs. And we find this to be a problem more and more over the past even 3 to 5 years. That is, global media outlets like The Guardian and The New York Times see their job as appealing to their niche of readers. and they don't want to write anything that will offend their readers. Now, the Guardian readers are, of course, largely anti-Israel, many of whom are anti-Semitic. So they, I think, are so embedded and so wedded to reinforcing their brand, or reinforcing their image as the go-to place for anti-Israel commentary, that I think there's a disincentive within the culture of the Guardian to ever change their institutional hostility to Israel. So we consider this to be post-truth. That post-truth meaning that truth doesn't really matter. That what matters is narrative. What matters is telling a story that makes their readers feel comfortable, that doesn't make their readers feel uncomfortable. And I feel this is a dynamic that is beyond maybe the scope of it's kind of like in the intellectual realm. It's something that on Monday I was at the inaugural conference of the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism by David Hirsch. And this is, and he describes his mission as trying to change the intellectual undercurrents within British public life. So there are people working on these larger currents, but I guess I just want you, when you look at a Guardian headline, to think in terms of why they wrote that headline. They wrote that headline because they want to satisfy their readers. They don't want to challenge their readers, they want to satisfy their readers. Okay, so let's talk about a few things that we can't do, reporting that we can't correct. All right, so merely biased reporting about Israel, we can't do anything about. We can't demand that they be more pro-Israel. Another example, and this is really important because even though we believe that Palestinian anti-Semitism, which is based on survey after survey, is the worst, Palestinians are the most anti-Semitic people in the world, based on surveys by ADL, by Pew. We can't force them to use that context when writing about an article. We can't really get them to write about Palestinian incitement. I don't know how many of you have followed Palestinian Media Watch, but incitement within Palestinian society is a huge problem. So as though we write about that in our blog, on our sites, and on tweets, we can't get the editors, we can't get the journalists to write about that. And also we can't choose their story selection. They can choose whatever they want. But there are a lot of things that we can get them to do. Okay, for a period of time in the 2000s, 2010, 2012, there was a series of claims in media outlets that claimed that there were, in the West Bank, Jewish-only roads. Have any of you here heard that before? Anyone here came across the idea that there were roads in the West Bank for Jews only? Okay, it is an absolute and total fabrication. That is, it never existed. It's a complete fabrication. It's, to use an oft-repeated word, fake news. And living in Israel, I know that, but it took a lot of effort. But that's an example of errors that not only do we correct, but you don't see that claim really anymore, even in op-eds. Okay, and that's a really insidious lie because it reinforces the bigger lie of Israel as an apartheid state. Okay, also errors of omission. How many of you have read an article in The Guardian or some other mainstream outlet, and it'll have something along the lines of, Palestinians shot dead by Israeli. And you read the article, and there's very little context, right? And, oftentimes it doesn't take too much research to figure out that, well, the Palestinian was shot because he was committing a terrorist attack, and the Israeli soldier shot back. Now, that's an example of a substantive omission that we can get corrected because it's their job, and they wouldn't deny it, to give both sides of the story, to tell the who, what, when, and where of the story. So that's something that we come across quite a bit. My colleague who monitors the BBC, her name is Hadar Sela, she has continually documented how the BBC will use terrorism as a term when talking about a terror attack that happened in London Bridge attacks, but will not use that term ever, ever, ever when talking about a terrorist attack by Islamic Jihad or Hamas.
Militants.
Militants, a euphemism.
And activists.
Or sometimes even activists, exactly. So that's a double standard that we are continually trying to get them and hold them accountable for. Also, we can get them to correct misleading or inappropriate photos. I'll give you some good examples in a subsequent slide. There's also something in the editor's code which warns against conflating fact with opinion. That is, it's one thing to say that it's someone's opinion that, say, Israeli soldiers shot Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. It's another thing to say that it's a fact. And that's a very explicit bullet point in the editor's code. Another thing we can try to get corrected are articles or imagery or cartoons that are explicitly anti-Semitic per the Our Working definition. Everyone here familiar with the Our Working definition? Okay. Okay, who here remembers this cartoon in The Guardian from 2012?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Steve Bell, perhaps the most openly anti-Semitic cartoonist in the working today. Now, this is interesting because, I don't think you need to be a scholar or a student of anti-Semitism to know what this draws upon. Now, forget about Bibi Netanyahu. It's not about him. I don't care about him personally. But this was during the war in 2012. I think it was called Operation, I forget at this point. There's been a lot of operations since then. Defensive Shield. Yeah, I think so. I could be wrong. Anyway, now at the time, Steve Bell was responding to the fact that British government supported Israeli actions against Gaza terrorists, against Hamas. So naturally, Steve Bell, the conspiratorial mind that he has, I would argue that is imbued with anti-Semitic logic, and I don't use that term loosely. He saw it as an example of this powerful Jewish politician, the Prime Minister of Israel, holding William Hague and Tony Blair like puppets, drawing upon literally centuries of anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish power. I didn't have it in this slide, but I could show you cartoons from both the Arab media and even from Der Stürmer that draw upon this very trope. I mean, it's funny because, on one hand, it just seems so obvious, and on the other hand, it's easy to miss it, that this is just, to me, explicit anti-Semitism. Now, the interesting thing is, we complained to the Guardian's readers editor, who at the time was named Chris Elliott. Chris Elliott, though he didn't demand that Bell take the cartoon down, he basically agreed that this cartoon drew upon anti-Semitic tropes and that it shouldn't be repeated again. Now, Bell has published many other problematic cartoons since then, but nothing this degree of explicit anti-Jewish iconography. To me, this is just a stunning fact that this was published in a mainstream outlet.
2012.
Sorry? Oh, I don't think so. Returning Echo?
Castlet.
Castlet? Castlet was 2009.
2009.
Yeah.
We said that on
Pillar of Defense, Nachon. Yeah, Pillar of Defense. Okay. So, again, I'm here in part because I want those of you who aren't currently doing it to do so more often than you are, if you're so inclined, that is to push back against the media's misinformation about Israel. And by virtue of that, the media's misinformation about Jews who support Israel, Zionists. So however you choose to communicate with mainstream media outlets, whether it be on social media, whether it be via email or some other way, we ask you that you follow these basic rules, which maybe seem intuitive, but you'd be surprised how many people just have a hard time controlling their anger and just, kind of let it rip. Be concise and get to the point. Choose your words carefully. Don't rant. Don't be angry. Just be professional and polite, and also assume good faith. Don't make personal or ad hominem attacks. Stick to the facts. Be accurate and include a source. Choose your targets wisely. Don't go after the fringe outlets. Go after the mainstream outlets. For those of you that aren't on Twitter, I'd highly recommend, if you have the time, to be involved with Twitter. And also, we found that the more that you contact with editors and media outlets, the more you contact with them constructively, the more likely they are to return your emails. If they see you as someone who's serious, someone who's sober, someone who isn't just going off on rants, we find that you can build respect with these editors. They might not like your message, but they will oftentimes respond if they feel that you're someone who isn't just going out there to attack. And this is kind of cheeky, but don't accuse everyone of being anti-Semite. Let's use that term carefully, per the Our Working definition. Okay, those of you who aren't familiar with the editor's code, it's very important to be acquainted with it, because this is the reference point that we use to go after media inaccuracy. Okay, so the press must take care not to publish inaccurate, misleading, or distorted information or images, including headlines, very important, including headlines that are not supported by the text. Significant inaccuracy, misleading statement, or distortion must be corrected promptly and with due prominence, and where appropriate, an apology published. A fair opportunity to reply to significant inaccuracies should be given when reasonably called for. The press, while free to editorialize and campaign, must distinguish clearly between comment, conjecture, and fact. These are the bullet points you need to know when complaining. How many of you remember, but the predecessor to IPSO, the Press Complaints Commission, there was a series of time when the Guardian was writing articles and commentary claiming that Tel Aviv was the capital of Israel. That is, they weren't just saying that most countries put their their embassies in Tel Aviv. They were saying that Tel Aviv was the capital of Israel. That's just nonsense. I mean, it's just completely untrue. It just has it's not arguably true. It's not, an opinion. It's just something that's not true. Well, believe it or not, the Press Complaints Commission, which was a very flawed body, actually upheld a complaint by one of our competitors on its reporting, and they were forced to apologize. And you rarely see media outlets anymore using Tel Aviv as a metonym or for Israel's capital, or saying outright that Tel Aviv is the capital. It might seem like a small matter, but it's to show you where we've come from, to show how bad it was. They were just writing whatever they wanted to, and this is one of the situations where complaining led to a good result. Okay, so there's the Independent Press Standards Organization, which replaced the PCC. Many outlets opted in to be governed by their body: the Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Standard. However, unfortunately, a lot of well-read outlets decided not to be part of their organization, such as The Guardian, the Financial Times, The Independent, The Economist. These outlets all opted out, which means that we've much less leverage over them than if they would have opted in. The Guardian actually, I think, kind of almost just, it makes me laugh almost. They wrote an editorial at the time when they decided not to opt into IPSO, and they claimed, in effect, that they can police themselves, which is just funny. And they set up what they described as an independent review panel, but our experience is it's almost impossible to win when you appeal to the independent review panel. And the BBC has a completely different process for adjudicating complaints. Okay, I mentioned before that there's forms, okay? So I don't know how many of you have ever made complaints, but I highly recommend, just if you go into their website of the Times or the Telegraph, they have dedicated online complaint forms that if you fill out, will go directly to the relevant editor. And why is that important? Because once it's in the hand of the editor, they know that someone complained that takes this seriously enough that used their online complaint forms, and they will respond to you within a couple of days. Okay, let's go over the BBC briefly. Again, my colleague Hadar Stella is the expert in the BBC. But many people get frustrated because they have such an opaque process that it really takes a little bit of time to figure out how to complain effectively to the BBC. All right, so first, just a few pointers, and I think Lawrence will make this as a PDF available for everyone who's watching in, so you'll be able to reference this. But just quickly, we recommend that you use the dedicated BBC website complaints form, because complaints submitted that way must be recorded by the BBC, so there's a record of it. On that form, please tick yes to the question of, do you want to reply? Also, keep a screenshot or a copy of your complaint. So when you fill out the form, make a screenshot so you have it in case they, quote unquote, lose it. Make sure you reply to the confirmation email sent by the BBC after the submission, and that confirmation email usually comes within 1 hour of the complaint. Otherwise, your complaint will not be registered. Also, try to link the points you raise in your argument to specific bullet points within the BBC editorial guidelines rather than making a general statement. You'll find those BBC editorial guidelines on that URL that we have linked here, which again, I'll send to you. Lawrence will send to you. All right, so the system of the BBC has two initial stages, which are outsourced to a private company, interestingly, 1A and 1B. Now, only at stage 2 do you actually have contact with BBC staff themselves, a department known as the Executive Complaints Unit. So refuse to accept unsatisfactory responses to the early stages because the ECU, again, the Executive Complaints Unit, sometimes overturns them. Very important to remember that. And also, you can't complain to Ofcom about BBC broadcasts until you've exhausted the BBC process. So again, go through the BBC complaints process. Also, be patient. Literally, my colleague Hadar, sometimes we've gotten corrections after 5 months. That's how long. You have to be unbelievably patient. I mean, they have so many problems within their complaint system, and we're trying to rectify that. We're trying to be involved in the process whereby they make it simpler. But for the time being, we think it's important that you complain to the BBC, but to be patient. Interestingly, once the Guardian opted out, or not interestingly, tellingly, the Guardian list is the top outlet that has been the recipient of more complaints about erroneous coverage by Ipso. So even though they opted out, they are still tops in the list of complaints received by Ipso about them. Unfortunately, Ipso can't do anything about them. Okay, now, though I showed you online forums at the Times and the Telegraph, there's also at the Financial Times, they have a corrections email called corrections@financialtimes.com. Usually gets a response. Okay, let me give you an example of some corrections that we've gotten and why I think it's important. I don't know how many of you remember this headline and this photo. This was in 2015, I believe, maybe 14. And the headline says, Gazans flee floods caused by Israel's dams opening. Now, what strikes, anybody here remember that? And what strikes you as odd about that headline? Anybody?
This is dams.
Right, exactly. There were no dams. Right. Right. I mean, okay. Now, this was in AFP. This was in Agence France Presse. So this wasn't a major outlet. Now, again, it's more than just the fact that there weren't dams that could have been opened that could have flooded Gaza, which, by the way, was simply flooded by, rain. Think about just the malevolence that they're imputing to Israelis, that the Israeli government woke up one day and said, you know what, just for fun, let's decide to open the floodgates and flood Gaza. I mean, at some point, an editor at AFP, just the fact that they, that they found that there was credulity, that they believed that could be possible. In addition to the fact that there was clearly no fact checking, right? Because if they would check the facts, they wouldn't have published this. But I think this is a perfect example that we were able to get that corrected. But the fact that the media was willing to publish this and go with a story that had absolutely no evidence whatsoever, that it shows you, I think, just it's a great indictment, I think, of the media and their confirmation bias, that if they see something that will make Israel look bad, oftentimes they won't engage in the most basic, most rudimentary fact checking. Where's the headline? Okay. I want everyone to look at this headline and tell me what you think happened. This was in 2016 during the knifing intifada that happened in Israel. Does anybody just offer to tell me, based on the words merely in the headline, what occurred?
The van rammed into people, into Israelis, causing injury. And eventually, it was dealt with and shot. But that's how our hostile media, it starts with how Israel responded, not who perpetrated,
right?
Who was the first aggressor. It goes on all throughout the media.
Exactly.
It all started when Israel fought back.
Right. But I think this is even more, I mean, the fact that you know this, I think the words are just unintelligible. It's such a weird, it's weird grammar. Israeli troops shoot dead driver of Ram car. Anyway, so I'm bringing this up to show you that we decided to, instead of tweeting publicly to the editor of Euronews, whose name is Peter Barabas, we decided to send him a private message on Twitter. And to his credit, he looked at the headline and he said, you know what, we got it wrong. We were so pressed for time that we got it wrong. And he was the editor of Euronews, yeah. So they changed it to something I think you'll agree is much clearer. Israeli troops shoot dead driver who rammed car into soldiers. That is, it was a ramming attack. And to prevent them from being killed by this ramming attack, they shot the terrorist. But again, you find this oftentimes when it comes to terror attacks, you find these misleading headlines. Okay, who here is familiar with a notorious terrorist by the name of Samir Kuntar? Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with him, in 1979, he committed one of the most brutal terrorist attacks in Israeli history. That's actually different. Now, this one, he killed a family. He killed a father and two children, Naharia. And one of the children he killed, I mean, it's hard to even say, but he killed the one child by banging his head against a rock with his rifle. I mean, it was just brutal beyond description. And as a father, it's hard for me to even say those words. Okay, so he was one of the most notorious terrorists. At some point, he was released, I think, in the 2011 terrorist release. Now, look at he was killed at some point in 2017, 18. Look at the photo that The Guardian chose to illustrate this article about a brutal, murderous terrorist. What strikes you about that photo? What do you see? He's a family man. Yeah, I mean, on Twitter, I couldn't help myself, and I was sarcastic. I said something like, The Guardian shows the family-friendly child killer, Samir Kuntar. I mean, there's just something so odious about depicting him as a lover of children when he murdered Israeli children with his bare hands, which is I was just outraged. And I just looked to the Guardian site and I found out that there's a woman who is the editor of photos. She is the editor that decides which photos will accompany which articles, which of course the journalist doesn't decide. So I hope you can see my tweet. And this is before Twitter expanded to 280 characters, so I had to condense it. I said, can you please explain the Guardian's decision to use this photo to depict terrorists who murdered a 4-year-old girl? To her credit, she responded, thank you for pointing out the inappropriate use of this picture. We have now changed the illustration with this article now. And here's the changed photo, which is just a generic stock photo, which is fine. Again, it depends on the situation. Sometimes we use Twitter, sometimes we go email, sometimes we use a private message on Twitter. But in this case, we've identified the appropriate editor who is responsible for making sure that the photo was appropriate, and we got it corrected. All right, so I tried to go through these quickly because I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, and but I do want everyone to get my contact information. I have business cards, and please tweet me if you're on Twitter. In closing though, I just feel that, people always ask me, they say, are you really making a difference day in, day out? Do you really think you have any power to push back against a global media outlet like The Guardian or The Independent or Sky News or BBC? And look, I wouldn't do my job every day for the past 12 years if I didn't think that what I was doing made a difference. I don't think we're going to change the world, but I think we are moving the ball a little bit. We're making progress. What we do is evolutionary, not revolutionary, but I think we keep them accountable. I think if it wasn't for our work and the work of our supporters like you, I think the media, as bad as it would be much worse. So my hope at the end of this is that you join us, that we become part of your conversation, that you give us tips. I scour the British media every day. My colleague scours the BBC every day, but we miss things. So I'm hoping that you'll use this presentation and this relationship to get involved, to be part of what we do every day, to push back against these insidious anti-Israel narratives. Thank you.
We've got some questions. The first one is from Maggie Griffith, and the second one is from Dahlia. So Maggie, whenever you're ready.
Hello. Put me on video as well, for a second. I think you'll find I'm actually Tom. I've left it in my wife's name. Apologies for that. Thank you, Adam, for a very helpful overview. You describe one of the false and accurate claims being the apartheid lie. So my question to you, I've got two questions arising from this. How do you distinguish between fact and opinion in practice? Because a lie could be construed as false facts, not merely as inaccurate opinions. So therefore, is the identification of Israel with apartheid a false fact, or is it a false opinion? And the follow-up to that is, how can you challenge specific journals or media when a specific criticism of Israel is so well endorsed by authoritative or so-called authoritative sources, in this case, influential UN and Amnesty voices about Israel and apartheid?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so the difference is if a media outlet says that Amnesty and B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch have published reports accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, that's a factual statement. If they publish an op-ed or an article in which they state in their own words and their own voice that Israel is an apartheid state, then that's simply conflating fact with opinion. So, you know, oftentimes we have pushed back so much as we can about these many holes in these reports by Amnesty, by B'Tselem, and by Human Rights Watch. But the fact is that they have made these accusations. So the media outlets simply repeats that these NGOs, as problematic as they are, have accused Israel of being an apartheid state. There's nothing we can do. But if they use it in their own voice, then we can push back, because it's not a fact. It's simply an accusation, a lie, we think, but an accusation made by a selective few NGOs. Does that answer your question?
Not quite, because there's a difference in a journal between, say, editorial and journalist pieces in which they're entitled to express their own opinion on any matter, political matter, whatever that is. So I would suggest that a journalist isn't a journalist or writer, or an article is entitled to express his or her opinion about any matter. How can you go against that? Different with an editorial, I get that, but it's part of sorry to say, it's free speech.
No. Let me just be very clear. Maybe I misunderstood your question. We believe strongly in free speech. We oppose cancel culture. We don't believe speech should be silenced. We think the answer to bad speech is more speech, not less speech. And you're right, there is a difference between an op-ed and an article. What I was trying to illustrate in the first example I gave you was in an article, a news article, a straight news article.
Okay.
You're right, in an op-ed, there's much more leeway. And again, we completely respect their right to engage in free speech. We might write a blog post that refutes their argument, but yes, you make a very good point. The distinction between an op-ed and a straight news article is a very important one to make.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, next we've got Dahlia, and then we've got Gary. Gary, when you're seat, we'll sit next to Adam, so everyone will be able to see you on the screen. But Dahlia, do you want to go next?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I was just wondering, how does your organization differ from honest reporting? Because I thought CAMERA was specifically for university students.
No, Honest Reporting is a competitor. Honest Reporting just is another organization based in Israel that fights media bias. And CAMERA, we do have a big campus division, but that's only one element of what we do. Most of what we do is combating inaccurate statements about Israel. So Honest Reporting is simply a competitor of ours. We have no relationship with them, but we do have a big campus division, but that's only a small part of what we do.
Okay, right. My daughter is the spokesperson for Yair Lapid, so she deals with the media, and I've heard some horrific stories from her. So it's very hard work. It's very, very hard work, and it's vital work that needs to be done.
Is that Karen?
Yes.
Yes, I've met Karen. She does very good work.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, next we have Gary.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Yeah.
Over the last 3 weeks, there's been quite a lot of publicity and many, many articles written in our Jewish Chronicle by the political editor David Rose and some of his colleagues about corruption, torture, and the absolute brutal treatment of Palestinians by the Palestinian Authority. There are, in the UK now, just starting to get initiatives going to try to stop this, and particularly to stop the British government giving money to Palestinian Authority. Has this been an issue elsewhere in the world, particularly in the United States? Has anyone ever tried to do anything about it before?
By anybody, you mean governments?
Governments or groups in the United States pressurizing governments?
There have been efforts in the U.S. to require that any U.S. funding that goes to the Palestinian Authority cannot be used to pay terrorists or their families. As you know, pay to slay.
Yes.
But as far as the particular, torture by the security officials, I don't think that's really been on the radar as much.
Okay.
I think it should be. I think it's a very important issue. And maybe that will be.
Well, there was a lot of undercover work done over a 6-week period in summer by Mr. Rose and his colleagues, which uncovered some absolutely horrendous stories, about raping female prisoners and this sort of thing. And most unbelievable torture. And a lot of this was new. It was just so bad. Everyone knew something wasn't going according to plan, it wasn't going right, but nobody knew it was quite this bad. It's had a lot of publicity in the British press, and a number of groups started to think about what to do about it. That's why I was wondering if anyone else wasn't feeling the answers.
I think probably from a policy standpoint, it's difficult because on the one hand, it's the UK and the US consider to be in their best interest to fund Palestinian security because they're, a key part of the overall strategy to keep the terrorist groups, out of power. On the other hand, you're right. The torture and the other inhumane methods that they use, it's hard to justify giving funds to security apparatuses that engage in torture. That's a policy decision. But I think it's just only recently become to be a big story. And so I hope that it continues to be amplified.
Well, it's only just become a big story in the UK. It wasn't a story before until 3 weeks ago.
Okay, well, then that's to their credit to amplifying that. Yeah.
Next up, you've got Tim from the web and then Carl. So Tim, you want to?
Hi there. First of all, can I also thank you for a very interesting presentation, which was very explicit and very helpful. And I do agree with an aspect that you mentioned in the replies, that there are a great number of ways in which we can experience this anti-Semitism, and different organisations deal with different parts of it. And yours clearly is to do with print media, print online, the wording anyway. What I wanted to ask you is this. There is, which I only found out fairly recently, a publication which has been made by the Unite Trade Union in the UK, which is very damning and which is intended to seek to persuade the membership not to support buying Israeli companies' shares from their pension fund. And it's obviously printed by the union officials who are on the far left. And I wondered whether that was something which you had actually dealt with, which you would deal with, or which is outside your remit.
We do consider ourselves a counter BDS and counter delegitimization organization, but that's not the bulk of what we do. The bulk of what we do is media focused. We do partner with other organizations that specifically fight BDS. I just met today with the head of We Believe in Israel. We're in contact with lots of anti-BDS organizations, but we wouldn't get involved on a grassroots level. So that's, I wouldn't say it's completely outside of remit, but that's not something that we would probably launch a campaign about. Yeah, as important as it is.
Thank you for your excellent presentation, and we will do everything to join the campaign to be real agitators and to hold the media to account. Before I ask just a very brief question, I have not a statement but a plea from the bottom of my heart. I beg Israeli governments, authorities, media, spokesmen all over the world, Jewish personalities, to stop using our enemy's parlance, to stop using the fake nationality invented in 1964, the Palestinians. The Beatles preceded them by 1 year. They came on show in 63. There are no Palestinians, they're Arabs. We should stop using the expression West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. We should stop using the occupied territory and giving credence to our enemies and delegitimizing the very Israel. We should only use the correct parlance. One of our worst enemies and the worst culprits that we have to fight. We know about the Guardian, the Independent, all the others. They are notorious. I don't think they can be reformed. It's like that. They will die one day, but they will always be like that. We should fight them. My bone of contention is the BBC. Colonel Richard Kemp said that the BBC is one of the main promoters of worldwide anti-Semitism. We must listen to him. They get out too easily out of the way they have constructed their ethos. They have stopped even pretending to be objective or to impart news. They are very partial. Jeremy Bowen, a few months ago, actually chastised the Jews. They should look deep into their souls. Now, this is not a BBC reporter. They have a notorious line of correspondents in Israel that are actually agents of an alien institution. They should be kicked out. The last is Yolande Knell. Her track record is abominable. A few years ago, when there was that terrible attack in the synagogue in the shul in Jerusalem, and 4 rabbis were attacked and chopped to pieces. One of them was from Hendon here, horrendous. And Naftali Bennett was an eloquent spokesman. He wasn't there in the government. And he was being interviewed. He was very good, persuasive. And then he said, let me show you images from the synagogue with the blood and so on. And she refused. We cannot show this to our listeners, our viewers and so on. Ever since she's based in Jerusalem, she's notorious. She and all Orla Guerin, and there is a long, long line. They have stopped even pretending to be reporters or presenters of facts. We must consider not only how about the Balin, notorious Balin report. It's Martin Bashir or whatever was a little clown, a joker in comparison to. They said it's not what he did about Mrs. Diana's interview. It was the cover-up. With the Bailey report, we have the mother of all cover-ups. More than 20 years, and they are allowed to keep it under lock and key. We should fight all the time. They are being paid by us, by license fee payers. The BBC should not be allowed to carry on being so vile, anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. I would again beg you to tell us how to mount a serious challenge to the BBC.
Okay. First of all, let me just make clear that I think it's important to avoid, for I think strategy reasons, to avoid the word anti-Semitism unless a journalist or an editor or a broadcaster says something that's within the scope of the IRA working definition. And I think it's kind of productive to to not use IRA as a guide. So number one, that's just addressing one of your questions. Okay, so what you can do is one of the things that I mentioned, which is to use the BBC complaint form. The more people, the more people that complain, the more likely they are to have to listen. Thirdly, we've been working together and taking advantage of the fact that the Jewish Chronicle is under different ownership. And in my view, much more receptive to the importance of anti-Israel media and the impact that has on Jews. They're aware of the fact that when it was in 2015, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism released a poll that showed that 82% of British Jews believe that media bias against Israel impacts British Jews negatively, right? So I think you'll find that the Jewish Chronicle is a more open forum for critical op-eds, for critical stories about the BBC than previously was the case. And that's important because I think that gets to the center of building a consensus within the British Jewish community that the BBC is a problem. Look, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing we can do that's going to get them to immediately change their view. It's an institution. Institutions are hard to change. But the best you can do is use what's out there. Complain, write op-eds, tweet, contact us when you see something egregiously misleading or inaccurate. So there's not just one thing, there's a lot of things, and just be patient because change takes a long time. And, you know, I've been doing this for 12 years, and I wish there was some simple way that we could really, really get them to change their behavior. But the best thing we can do are the things that we're doing, but to continue doing them consistently and effectively. Okay. Sure.
Right. Adam, can I butt in there? I know the young lady from HGS wants to say something.
Sure.
But really, I was going to ask you about Jeremy Bowen, and I've had the task taken away from it. But how do you generally deal with the systemic bias which nurtures a narrative which drives hate, radicalization, etc.? You see it in the Guardian, very clear bias. It is not crossing any arbitrary lines. It is probably not anti-Semitic. It's a very clear bias. That's my first question. And my second question is, what can NJA members specifically do to help you to amplify your message and expand what you're doing? Do you want us to share articles with you, send copies of what complaints etc. we're doing? Do you want us to monitor journals for you? What can we do to help really amplify your important work?
Look, I mean, just to repeat, I want everybody at the NGA to be my eyes and ears, to read the British media as often as you have time, as much as you have the koach to do it. Send me tips. You know, I try to catch as much as I can, but I can't catch everything. So I want you to email me when you see something that's problematic. Let's engage in a conversation. You know, oftentimes what we do at Camera UK is triage, meaning there's 10 problematic articles. We have to decide which one is the most problematic, and that's when we focus our energies on. So I want you to be in contact with us, to give us tips, to read also. In Israel, so it's hard to get print publications. So to read, for instance, the print edition of The Economist. I don't know if anybody here has a subscription to The Economist. To read the print edition of the Financial Times. You know, we catch a lot, but sometimes the print edition has a different version of the online version. To read British publications like, I don't know if anybody here is a physician, but Lancet, British Medical Journal. There are some media outlets that just because we have a limited bandwidth, we can't focus on everything. So just read as much as you have the energy to read and send me problematic material and let's engage in conversation and we'll go. If you find something that's we missed, I'm psyched because sometimes we miss things. And to answer your first question, who here has heard of Abdel Barry Atwan?
Yeah, I think we all have. Yeah.
Okay. So to me, that he is the biggest priority that Camera UK is focused on right now. He's platformed not only in BBC Arabic, but on BBC English.
Yes.
Somebody who is engaged in explicit anti-Semitic commentary per hour, both on Twitter and in Arabic and in English. Someone who continually endorses terrorist attacks that target Israeli civilians. And again, the Jewish Chronicle, not to promote them too much, but the Jewish Chronicle has been fantastic in focusing on this. Because to me, this is, you know, when it comes to picking and choosing the targets, this is the perfect target. And no other person who has extremist views like it would be given a platform, right? They're talking about deplatforming. We talk about cancel culture. Well, the fact that he's still given a platform and he's legitimized as some sort of reasonable, legitimate voice on Arab affairs, on Israeli affairs, I think is shameful. And I think to me, this is someone we should all focus on as a community because, I mean, his beliefs are just so extreme that
he endorsed the attack on Salman Rushdie, and I said, "Well done." This is the kind of this is the type of great contributor that the BBC offers a platform.
Exactly.
For
So
many years, it's nothing new.
Exactly.
Maybe
Thank
do that background so you can see.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Actually, it's less of a question, more of a suggestion, putting up in the comments about today and tomorrow. a lot of the time, the word West Bank comes across even in certain Jewish media. Some of Israel being one. And it's just funny because I do believe that words matter greatly, and we need to be precise in our speech. If we hope to counter, bias, prejudices, and often anti-Semitism in general. I know you don't like to use the word often. And so, do you think it would be worth maybe issuing some kind of a statement, maybe, or a suggestion to the media saying that, this, we feel a certain way about, certain words that do matter, and we would like you to refer from now on to Judea and Samaria, and we can't say that you don't know now because we told you publicly officially. Request that an answer be given. And if they do continue to use the word, then at least it's very clear about where it is that they stand in terms of their choices. Do you think it would be worth? I know that it's just something that irks me quite a lot because it comes across. For example, very recently on BBC Arabic, I was asked to comment, and the translator was referring to the West Bank, and I refused to acknowledge it. And I was like, I don't know what you're referring to. If you're talking about Judea and Samaria, then I can answer the questions.
Yeah.
And they were forced to, reframe their questions. And I think it's important because it's a small victory. It's a very, very small victory. But forcing people to use our language, I think, is also an expression of not just our sovereignty, but who we are as a people. Do you think it would be worth to do something, as, the Jewish community, with the help of maybe the Israeli government, and to actually make a statement and do something about it, and maybe force think tanks and other institutions to actually refer to Judea and Samaria as Judea and Samaria, because it is Judea and Samaria, and it's a lot more difficult for certain Palestinian groups to claim certain things when it's called Judea and Samaria.
Right. So you're 100% right that the media typically will say the West Bank, or what religious Israelis will call Judea and Samaria, as if it's some niche term, and it's completely misleading. You're 100% right. Okay, let me explain why I don't think that would be effective. In 2014, the PLO put out a media guidance document that they sent to all media outlets. And the focus of their media guidance was to get the media to stop referring to the Temple Mount as the Temple Mount, but to refer to it instead as Al-Aqsa Compound or Al-Aqsa Mosque. So tragically and sadly, that media guidance permeated somehow the media, atmosphere. And slowly we've noticed that it didn't happen right away, but after a number of years, media outlets will now increasingly refer to the Temple Mount as either Al-Aqsa Mosque Compound or as Al-Aqsa Mosque. Yeah. So I'm bringing that up to explain just the following fact, that media is very, very centered around what they feel is, Palestinian suffering. And they feel that their job is to give, voice to the powerless or the Palestinians. So they're much more likely to be receptive to a campaign by the Palestinians to change terminology. And if a similar campaign was launched by Israel or its supporters, they would probably dismiss it to use the pejorative as Hezbollah. Now, I'm saying that that's unbelievably unjust. It's unfair. I just, in my experience, it just seems like that's not a battle we would probably win in the short term. However, I applaud you for making the effort to do it. I just don't think it's a winnable battle for the short term. But thank you.
Great. I've got no more questions from the net. Are there any more questions in the room? I think Gary has offered just on behalf of the National Jewish Assembly, I would thank you so much for giving your time this afternoon to give you such an informative guide about what is happening in the media regarding how it is fostering and enabling anti-Semitism to develop, sometimes very slyly and sometimes quite overtly. But there's no question that, sadly, it's been quite effective, and your organisation and other organisations needs to do our best to counter this and get the correct message across. I think that over time, with effort, we will succeed, because there's a limited amount of things they can say, and eventually we should be able to get, for example, as you were saying,
how we actually name the temple mount, and other issues like that, and that Tel Aviv now is not the capital of Israel. We can make a few inroads, but it is a huge battle, and we all have to fight this together all over. So can I once again thank you so much for coming to London to speak to us. And thank you.
Thanks very much.
The last part for NJA, there is an anti-Semitism in the media and social media working group. And my sincere ask you to run that. This mainstream media, I think, the work which Canada does is fantastic. But if you do so much hate and nasty things that out there on social media, and we've actually here today doing incredible work, and you've given me incredible source material. You've got extreme gaming, lots of issues. If anyone wants to join on that group, drop a note to Dahlia or drop me an email. And it'd be lovely to see, lovely to work with you. The last thing is, I was at the same anti-Semitism conference with Adam, and they have these great suites. I don't know if you can read that. So there's a camera. It says anti-Semitism science. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And anyone who's here today, come and have it. Thank you. Okay.